Private Emile Clermont pressed his palms against both ears and still could not block the sound. It had no direction. It came from everywhere at once, from the ground beneath him, from the air above the parapet, from inside his own skull. A rolling, cascading detonation that seemed less like an explosion and more like the world tearing along a seam it had always hidden. The men around him in the communication trench were not soldiers in that moment. They were animals in a very small space, and the space was shrinking. Something was landing in a pattern, walking methodically toward their position with a patience that felt deliberate, almost personal, as though whatever was responsible for the sound knew exactly where they were and was simply taking its time arriving. Clermont did not know it then, but the thing taking its time was about to rewrite everything humanity believed it understood about how wars were fought. The years between 1914 and 1945 represent the most compressed period of weapons development in human history. In the span of a single generation, in many cases within the lifetimes of men who fought in both conflicts, warfare transformed from cavalry charges and rifle volleys into nuclear detonations and jet aircraft. What happened in between those two poles was not a smooth progression. It was a series of violent improvisations, each one responding to the last, each one raising the ceiling of destruction just high enough to demand something new and worse in return. This is the story of that transformation, not a catalog of specifications, but the human experience of what these weapons felt like, what they did to the bodies and minds of the soldiers who faced them, and what they revealed about the kind of future that industrial civilization was capable of building when it turned its full creativity toward killing. We will move through 2 wars, across multiple continents, through different kinds of terror. Some of it came from the air. Some of it crawled across the ground on steel treads. Some of it was invisible until it was already inside you. All of it left marks on the men who survived it that no subsequent peace could fully erase. Private Emile Clermont was a composite figure in the way that all infantrymen of the Western Front were composite figures. Individual men whose specific experiences dissolved into a collective trauma so total that the French, the British, and the Germans who survived it had difficulty afterward explaining to anyone who hadn't been there what the particular quality of that fear was like. The weapon taking its time outside his trench in the autumn of 1917 was artillery, but not artillery in the sense that earlier generations understood it. The smoothbore cannons of Waterloo or the field guns of the American Civil War, terrible in their moment, but limited in their reach and their rate of fire. This was industrial artillery, the kind that the major powers had developed through the preceding decades with methodical scientific investment, the kind that could fire shells weighing half a ton across distances of 20 miles, the kind that could sustain a barrage for hours, for days, for weeks without meaningful pause. The British bombardment preceding the Battle of the Somme on July 1st, 1916, lasted 7 days. Over 1 million shells were fired along a 14-mile front. The stated intention was to destroy the German defensive positions so completely that the infantry advance that followed would be almost administrative in nature. Men walking into positions from which all resistance had been eliminated. What actually happened on the morning of July 1st, when British soldiers climbed out of their trenches into the summer air, was the single bloodiest day in British military history. Approximately 57,470 British casualties in a single day. The German defenders had survived the bombardment in deep concrete shelters and emerged to man their machine guns as the British lines crossed no man's land. The failure was not the artillery itself. The failure was the assumption that enough of it could make the ground safe. That assumption would not survive the war, but the artillery would. What the historical record preserves about sustained artillery bombardment is not primarily its physical effects, devastating as those were. What it preserves is its effect on the human mind under sustained exposure. Shell shock, a term the British Army used officially beginning in 1915, before it was understood, before it was pathologized, before it was recognized as what we would now call severe combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder, produced symptoms that military medicine of the era had no framework to classify. Men who had not been physically wounded found themselves unable to speak, unable to walk, unable to stop trembling. Some were blind without ocular injury. Some had lost hearing that no physical damage explained. The British Army alone reported over 80,000 cases of shell shock by the war's end, with the real number almost certainly significantly higher, given the institutional pressure on soldiers to deny vulnerability. The cause was not weakness of character, as some military authorities initially argued. The cause was the sustained impossibility of the situation, hours and days inside an enclosed space while the ground convulsed around you, while men nearby ceased to exist without warning, while the rational mind was asked to remain functional inside conditions that the rational mind had no tools to process. Artillery did not merely kill. It unmade the psychological architecture that allows a human being to organize experience into coherent sequence. That unmade architecture is one of the defining legacies of the First World War. On April 22, 1915, near the Belgian town of Ypres, French and Algerian troops holding a section of Allied line watched a yellowish-green cloud moving toward them from the German positions. Some accounts describe soldiers initially puzzled by the color, by its density, by the way it rolled along the ground rather than dispersing upward. The cloud was approximately 4 miles wide. It had been released from 5,730 cylinders of chlorine gas positioned along the German front and driven toward Allied lines by a favorable wind. There was no doctrine for this. There were no gas masks in the Allied lines, because gas warfare at this scale had not been attempted before, and the planning frameworks did not include it. The soldiers in the path of the cloud experienced an immediate and catastrophic assault on the respiratory system. Chlorine attacks the mucous membranes, the eyes, the throat, the lungs, dissolving tissue at cellular level, producing a sensation that survivors described as drowning on dry land. Men ran. The Algerian and French units broke, creating a gap in the Allied line approximately 4 miles wide. The Germans, who had not anticipated the full effectiveness of the attack and had not prepared adequate reserves to exploit the breakthrough, failed to advance decisively through. The weapon worked beyond expectation. The follow-through failed. And in that gap between technological success and operational exploitation lay a recurring pattern that would define much of both world wars. The innovation arriving faster than the doctrine capable of using it. Mustard gas, introduced by Germany in 1917, was a different category of horror from chlorine. It was not primarily a killing agent. It was a casualty production agent, designed to incapacitate rather than kill immediately, to fill hospitals rather than cemeteries, because incapacitated soldiers consumed medical resources and disrupted operations in ways that dead soldiers did not. Mustard gas was a persistent agent that soaked into soil, clothing, and equipment, producing burns on any exposed skin hours after contact, long after soldiers believed themselves safely clear of the exposure zone. Men were blinded by it, burned across their bodies by a substance they could not smell effectively, and could not feel working until the damage was already done. The psychological impact of gas warfare was disproportionate even to its considerable lethality. The gas mask drill, the frantic 6-second race to get the respirator seated before inhalation, became a reflex so deeply conditioned in soldiers that many reported dreaming about it for decades after the war. The fear was not only of dying, it was of dying in that specific way, slowly, internally, in the burning dissolution that survivors described, and that no amount of courage or training or comradeship could prevent once the cloud reached you. The tank appeared for the first time in military history on September 15, 1916, during the Battle of Flers-Courcelette on the Somme. The British Mark I, a rhombus-shaped steel vehicle running on tracks, crawling at walking pace, carrying naval-patterned guns in sponsons on its sides, was intended to solve the problem that artillery had failed to solve, crossing no man's land under fire and breaking through the German trench lines. It was crude in almost every dimension. The crews inside operated in conditions of extreme heat, extreme noise, carbon monoxide accumulation from the engine, and so little visibility that navigation was a matter of estimation rather than observation. The mechanical reliability was poor enough that of the 49 tanks committed to the Flers-Courcelette attack, only 32 reached the starting line, and a significant portion of those broke down during the advance. But what the surviving tanks did, what they looked like to the German infantrymen who encountered them, was sufficiently alien to produce fear that operational effectiveness alone cannot explain. Men who had faced machine guns and artillery and gas found themselves facing something their prior combat experience contained no category for. A machine that moved under fire, a machine that could not be stopped by rifle rounds, a machine that crushed obstacles and crossed trenches that had been specifically designed to stop human movement. German accounts from Flers-Courcelette describe infantry abandoning positions not because they had been physically overrun, but because the tank's approach produced a crisis of nerve that nothing in their training addressed. The psychological weapon preceded the physical one. By the Second World War, the tank had been transformed beyond recognition from its 1916 ancestor. The interwar period produced competing doctrinal schools. the British experimenting with independent armored formations, the Germans developing the blitzkrieg integration of tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and air support into combined arms operations, the Soviets theorizing deep mechanized warfare before Stalin's purges eliminated the theorists. When the tanks of 1939 and 1940 met each other in France, in North Africa, and eventually on the Eastern Front, they bore almost no physical resemblance to the lumbering rhomboids of the Somme, but the fear they produced, the specific, visceral dread of armor approaching over ground that infantry cannot hold, was a direct inheritance from that September morning in 1916. The final, and in some ways most psychologically sophisticated weapon of the progression from trenches to tanks, was the one that removed the battlefield entirely. Strategic bombing, the deliberate sustained attack on an enemy's industrial capacity, infrastructure, and civilian population, had been theorized in the interwar period by figures like Giulio Douhet, whose 1921 work argued that air power could bypass armies and navies entirely and strike directly at the will of enemy populations to sustain war. The theory was brutal in its logic and imprecise in its predictions. The bombing campaigns of the Second World War, the German Blitz over Britain in 1940-41, the Allied strategic bombing of Germany from 1942 onward, the firebombing of Japanese cities in 1945, produced enormous destruction and significant industrial disruption, but they did not produce the swift civilian collapse that Douhet had predicted. What they produced instead was something more complicated. Communities under sustained aerial threat, developing psychological adaptations that no pre-war analysis had anticipated. A hardening rather than a breaking, alongside genuine and lasting trauma in individuals whose experience of the bombing was not statistical, but immediate and personal. The German civilians who emerged from the basements and shelters after RAF raids on Hamburg in July 1943, during Operation Gomorrah, in which the combination of incendiary and high-explosive bombs created a firestorm that reached temperatures of 800 degrees Celsius and killed an estimated 37,000 people in a week, were not the demoralized, surrender-seeking population that strategic bombing theory predicted. They were traumatized, bereaved, physically displaced. But they continued to work in factories when factories remained standing. They continued to function within the social frameworks that remained intact. This is not an argument against the destructiveness of strategic bombing. It is a recognition that human beings are capable of absorbing levels of violence that the theorists who designed the weapons had not modeled with sufficient sophistication. Private Clermont in his communication trench in 1917, listening to the artillery walking toward him through the Belgian earth. The Algerian soldiers at Ypres, watching the yellow-green cloud come across no man's land in April 1915. The German infantry at Flers, watching steel machines cross their wire in September 1916. The civilians in Hamburg basements in July 1943. These people did not experience history. They experienced specific moments inside history. Moments that history afterward organized into categories, into chapters, into documentary subjects, but that were lived from the inside as pure sensation and pure fear, with no organizing framework available. What connects them across the span of both wars is not the weapons themselves. The weapons changed beyond recognition between 1914 and 1945. What connects them is the recurring experience of being a human nervous system inside a situation that human nervous systems were not designed to process, and the recurring discovery that soldiers and civilians found ways to continue functioning anyway, at costs that no subsequent accounting has ever fully measured. The progression from trenches to tanks is not a story of weapons getting more powerful, though they did. It is a story of human communities discovering, repeatedly and expensively, that there is no technological solution to the problem of what war does to the people inside it. Every weapon that appeared between 1914 and 1945, every innovation in artillery, gas, armor, or air power, solved one tactical problem and created several psychological ones that the soldiers who carried them home were left to manage alone, in private, in the silence of peacetime that had no language adequate to what they had been inside. The trenches are gone now. The tanks are in museums. The men who survived both wars are gone too, almost entirely. But the question their experience poses, about what human beings owe each other in the design of the systems they create for mutual destruction, remains as open as it was on the morning of July 1st, 1916, when 57,000 men walked into the summer air and the ground answered.